Because I can tell you, for nursing, no state in the union is it mandatory that you be certified in nursing to practice. None. So your profession is actually ahead of nursing.
Beyond Clean offers a creative look into the inner workings of the healthcare industry committed to getting it right. Every instrument, every time. Join us every week as we explore the hidden world of one of the most important aspects of safe surgical care. And now your hosts, Hank Balch and Justin Poulin.
This week on Beyond Clean, we speak with Jim Stobinski, CEO at the Competency and Credentialing Institute. Jim has in excess of 25 years experience in the operating room with work roles that have included janitor, orderly, staff nurse, and a variety of supervisory positions. His education includes a diploma of nursing from the Toledo Hospital School of Nursing and a BSN and MSN from East Carolina University. He earned his PhD in International Health Research from Touro University International in June of 2011 for a study of competency and skill acquisition in perioperative nurses. In 2014, he was one of the authors of a research study published in the AORN Journal regarding the correlation between perioperative nursing characteristics and nursing-sensitive outcomes for surgical patients. Hank, I know that we are going to get into a lot of the data. You and I are kind of data heads, but collaboration with multiple different departments, this is going to be an exciting show. And Jim especially, I think, has a lot of interesting things to say that not only sterile processing listeners will enjoy, but obviously nursing and infection control professionals as well.
That's right, Justin. Every couple of years, there's a study that hits the industry and just sends shockwaves through it. I think one of those studies is going to be what we're going to be talking to Jim about today. But even stepping back from the study, he's going to bring a great perspective from the leadership level of a large credentialing organization involved with perioperative services, but as you said, has a specific view on all these other professionals that are also serving the surgical service patient through sterile processing, through certified surgical technicians. It's going to be a great show, and I can't wait to get to it.
All right, before we get into it, just want to remind everybody that you can follow Beyond Clean on Twitter at Beyond Clean Info, Facebook.com/Beyond Clean Podcast, and the LinkedIn page, LinkedIn.com/company/Beyond Clean. And before I give you our email address, I want to announce a sort of special edition of Beyond Clean that we plan to release at the end of CS week. That's the second full week in October. What we want to hear is success stories from our listeners in writing, just one or two paragraphs. Want to tout the impact that sterile processing is having on patient safety. It's really open-ended. It's really just meant to be an acknowledgement of everybody's good work. We'll definitely mention your hospital or your surgery center, your department, the person who sends in the submission. We'll get recognition on the show as well. But again, just a celebration of all the hard work that the CS professionals across the country and internationally are doing. To send that submission in, all you have to do, well, again, one or two paragraphs, an email to info@beyondclean.net. We'll be right back with Jim Stobinski. Speaking now with Jim Stobinski, CEO at the Competency and Credentialing Institute. Jim, I'm going to do a quick introduction just to your career. You have in excess of 25 years experience, not only in the operating room with work roles, which have also included janitorial, orderly, staff nurse, and a variety of supervisory positions. So I think what I like about your background is just how much of a broad experience you have within the hospital and the different roles in there. Welcome to the show. Thanks for joining in, Hank and I.
All right, glad to be here, and thank you for the invitation.
So maybe just give us a little bit of a further background, maybe expand on the introduction about your your experience, and then also tell us a little bit more about the Competency and Credentialing Institute as sort of an introduction for our listeners.
Okay, so I, in the way of background, I am a registered nurse. I've been in nursing since the mid-'80s, and some of the people on listening to the podcast may be familiar. I'm a diploma nurse. There aren't many of those around anymore. It used to be a hospital-based education program, and at one time, the majority of the nurses were educated that way. What's the importance of that? Diploma nurses got an introduction to the operating room. Traditionally, it was part of their training, and I received that. When I trained at Toledo Hospital School of Nursing in the early to mid-'80s, I was introduced to the operating room, and diploma nurses often worked their way through school and got a job at that hospital. And I did. And I really lucked out because I became a janitor in the operating room. And then an orderly as I worked my way through school, and then eventually hired directly into the operating room, which years ago, 3 decades, that wasn't very often done. But I really had a great background because in being a janitor and an orderly, you got to see how all of it worked. And it was a great introduction to the operating room. Eventually became a staff nurse, and then quickly I joined the United States Navy and worked as an operating room nurse in the Navy. And they very quickly push you into management leadership roles and began managing operating rooms relatively early in my career. So served in the military, always as a perioperative nurse and operating room nurse, and then retired from the military, and eventually I came to CCI. The Competency and Credentialing Institute, CCI, is a nonprofit, and our work is we provide certification for nurses. We only do programs for nurses. We're a nonprofit, and only nurses that have something to do with the operating room. So we're the largest organization in the world that does certifications for operating room nurses, and we also do education programs that support our certifications. We have 4 credentials, 4 different programs. CNOR, which is our biggest program, and all of these are worldwide for any nurse that meets eligibility criteria and can take our exams in English. It can be done around the world. We have 40,000 plus CNORs, and we test 4,000 to 5,000 a year for that exam. And we have 3 other certifications. CRNFA, which is a relatively small credential. There's about 1,100 certified. About 50 take the exam each year. That's for nurses that work as surgical assistants. We have an advanced practice credentials, clinical nurse specialist certified perioperative, which is CNSCP. And then our most recent program that we developed in 2015 is CSSM, Certified Surgical Services Manager. And that is our fastest growing credential. And we have now 60 to 100 people a year take that exam. But that is the one that's going the fastest. So,
that's incredible.
Thank you. The other thing is nursing certification groups go. We're one of the largest among the different specialties, and perioperative nurses are one of the largest specialties in nursing, but we're an industry leader along with there's some other big groups like critical care nursing, pediatrics, hospice and palliative care is big. So we're right up there with those groups. The other thing that I should mention, in all of our certification exams, there's a connection to central processing because all of them have exam content that touches on decon, sterilization, those practices. It's all part of our exams.
Yeah, I'm sure the point of use cleaning is a big part of that too. And before we dive into that, I just want to acknowledge something you said as you were introducing yourself as a diploma nurse. I wound up getting my CNA while I was going to nursing school and had the opportunity to have some hands-on and really deal with nursing, which is a very intimate profession. And I can't tell you how many people, since they've abandoned that style of program, how many people that I went to school with that spent 2 years in their undergrad and then all of a sudden went to do bed baths and other clinical activities in that first time as a junior that wound up dropping out because they just realized that they weren't capable of doing that, and that it really wasn't a good match for what they were hoping to get out of nursing originally. So I often wonder what the obstacles are to going back to more hands-on right away. And sometimes what I'll tell people when friends say, oh, so-and-so, my niece or my nephew wants to become a nurse, I always say, tell them to get their associates and get some hands-on and then start working and doing the job and using that to help them pay for their bachelor's once they're, at a higher wage, and also have the opportunity to potentially have some of their education covered by their employer.
True. Hey, Justin, can I ask, where did you, this experience you described, where did you do that experience? Where were you living when?
Yeah, I was in the University of Maine, so tucked away in the northeast corner of the United States where most people think it's Canada.
Yeah, the thing about diploma programs, there was a very distinct geographical flavor there. In places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Illinois tended to have a lot of them, and they held on for quite a while. You make a very good point, though, about clinical experience, and sadly, nursing is struggling to find that balance. What is the right amount of hands-on clinical experience with the academic experience? And we're struggling to reach that balance. It's not an easy thing to achieve, and many diploma nurses are nostalgic, and they say, why can't we just educate nurses that way? It's not an issue that we've solved yet in nursing. We've got room to improve there yet.
Well, I think a constant theme on this show for Hank and I has been there's always room to improve when it comes to educational material. And you were talking about how your programs are incorporating sterile processing knowledge. And I know I just talked about point of use cleaning, which will really help keep the instrument sets moving quickly. I mean, there's nothing like dried on blood to slow things down and decontamination. So maybe talk a little bit about that content and how it's being received by the nurses, this other perspective, because I think there's a big industry change in reimbursement specifically that is placing an emphasis in this area.
Yeah, and I think what you cite, I think one thing that nursing could do a little better, just Jim's opinion, is benefiting from the knowledge and the expertise of the other professions we work with. Let's be real honest here. Not every operating room do we have wonderful communication and cooperation between the people doing the surgery and the people that are doing very important work in sterilization. And we don't always realize, each group doesn't realize the other's perspective or appreciate the value that they can bring. You mentioned there about reimbursement strategies and the emphasis on things like there's the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services have a program called value-based purchasing, which basically we're all subject to, essentially all healthcare. And there's an emphasis on cutting down on preventable complications like surgical site infections. So one great example where central processing and nursing can come together in surgical care is for nursing to gain more knowledge about what can they do to make the work of central processing better and more efficient, and ultimately get instruments with a higher assurance that the instruments are ready to go, they're done more efficiently, and how can they work together to achieve that, which ultimately brings us to things like lower surgical site infections. And so I think there's room to grow there and increase the communication between those work areas. Sadly, we haven't always worked together well, and I think that's an area we could do better.
Yeah, Jim, even from the sterile processing certification side, something that's interesting that when you spoke earlier about having those portions in the training for OR nurses, our certification through the ISHM organization, the CRCST, the source material for that exam, and a lot of technicians, as they're taking the exam, they don't even realize this, but the questions are coming oftentimes out of the AORN guidelines in addition to AME and the textbook. And so that interdisciplinary practice that you're proposing there, goes both ways. It's not just asking nurses, hey, pay attention more to what's going down in the basement, but also on the other side, how can our sterile processing teams be more cognizant of what can make it easier and safer, more efficient for our nurses and surgical techs when they get these trays to open them in a way that's not going to contaminate the sterile field, for instance. Having that kind of vision and perspective can only come when you're having that two-way conversation, like you said. So that's a great point.
To the earlier question, to more fully address that, how is this content received? I can tell you that if we use the example of CNOR, which probably has the greatest amount of content about sterilization, decon practices, that is one of the areas that people cite that really makes them anxious about taking the exam. Our certification exam, in perioperative nursing, we don't have a standardized way to enter the profession. There's not an agreed upon training course. And one of the areas that often suffers is learning about sterilization. For a lot of nurses, they may never work in or supervise a central processing area, and their interaction may consist of, going down and trying to get their sets or cover some emergency need or something. A lot of perioperative nurses don't understand sterilization well, and they're not really motivated to learn more about it. I was fortunately introduced, especially when I was an orderly, I interacted a lot with the central processing staff, and luckily in my training, we had one full semester in the OR. So that was my introduction, and for some reason, I really like the orderly nature of central processing, sterilization, the documentation. It was always so, it seemed so clear to me, and it made so much sense, and I liked it. And so later in my career, I had operating rooms that I supervised that included central processing, and I've always stayed connected. But not all perioperative nurses are that way, and sterilization is not their favorite topic to cover on the certification exam. That and emergency procedures tend to give people the most grief.
They probably give people the most grief in their day-to-day work as well. I mean, emergency procedures could be a scary situation and one that's difficult to plan for, and sterilization is one that can often be very foreign and existing in a separate department, so their exposure to both situations is sometimes limited. We're going to wrap segment 1. We're going to be right back with Jim Stobinski. We are back with Jim Stobinski. And Jim, I really want to talk about an article I read in OR Manager exploring the relationship between surgical site infections and nursing certifications. And I believe you presented on this topic at the 2017 AORN Global Surgical Conference and Expo. Maybe just introduce the study, some of the findings, and give us a background for our listeners.
All right. So the CCI has a very active research agenda, and we've been doing this for years, but over the last 3 or 4 years, we've forged a partnership with researchers that work with the National Database of Nursing Quality Indicators. So we are exploring the relationship between certification status, education levels, other factors in the operating room, and complications. And the most common one is surgical site infection. So we've looked at other things like, do they develop a pressure ulcer if they've had a long surgery, or a urinary tract infection if they placed a Foley catheter in the operating room. We've looked at that. But then we came to realize that the most common complication that can happen in the operating room is the surgical site infection, and it's not easy to track this, but estimates range from 2 to 5% of all surgeries will develop a surgical site infection. They're horrendously expensive and obviously have a devastating effect on the patient and the family. But, we've had surgical site infections for years, but when CMS started their value-based purchasing program and up the reporting requirements, there are now financial incentives. The net is that you will receive less reimbursement if you have a high surgical site infection rate. So you can have surgeons churning out a lot of cases, but if the quality is poor, it will hurt your reimbursement. So now there's an interest in examining what are the things that contribute to surgical site infections. Can we change them? And if we change certain things like education levels or certification status, are there things we could do proactively that would help us in these areas? And that's the focus of our research, to include the research that I reported on in the spring of 2017 at Surgical Conference and Expo, the big AORN meeting.
So, Jim, you say that there could be a link, there possibly could be a link, and that's what the research is focusing on. What preliminary findings have you seen that are either validating that hypothesis or maybe challenging it?
All right, so let me just, one little piece of background. 4 or 5 years ago, I came to CCI 6 years ago. 4 or 5 years ago, we wanted to really up our game in doing research, and the CEO at that time, we had a discussion, and she posed a great question. She said, what if you do this research and we find out that it truly doesn't make any difference, and everything we base certification on, it doesn't hold up? And we debated that for a while, and finally we said, you know what? If that's the case, we'd like to know, which means we would have to improve certification or do it differently. So we decided to press ahead and do the research. So about 3 years ago, we examined, basically we tried to correlate, if the more nurses you have, does that make a difference in complications in the OR? And in that first study, we didn't look at surgical site infections, and because we couldn't get to the data. And what we found, there were no strong results. There was nothing that, we didn't find anything bad about having higher certification rates. It didn't hurt, but we didn't have strong statistical evidence that it made a significant difference. Statistically, it didn't come out. But we learned some things from the first study, and we figured out the most costly thing, especially most costly complication, is surgical site infections. So how do we get to that data? Because with the National Database of Nursing Quality Indicators for many hospitals, we knew a lot about the nursing workforce, what their education levels were they certified or not, what certifications. But NDNQI, that database, doesn't collect information about SSI. But surgical site infections, there's mandatory reporting to, eventually that makes its way through to the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services, one of their branches, but you have to connect to the database. We worked with NDNQI and funded the research, and we got to the right agency that had that information about surgical site infections. It exists in a database called the National Health Safety Network Database. It's in there. And we got permission to match up what we knew about hospitals and their structure and the nursing workforce with that database for dozens of hospitals. And that was the basis of the study that I reported on in the spring of 17, is that connection. But that study, funded by CCI, was the first time anybody had ever connected the NHSN database and the NDNQI database that tells us so much about nursing. The first time it had ever been done, and it had to be funded to make it happen, and that's what CCI did.
Well, and in one of our previous episodes, we talked about big data and the power of big data in terms of efficiencies in the operating room and efficiencies in sterile processing departments. And we're going to talk about that a little bit in the next section, but something that I wanted to bring out here is with this information that's been there, so it's not like you are starting to gather this, it's in these databases, but it sounds like what your team is doing is, for the first time, connecting these data points to show, one way or the other, what is the difference? Is there a difference? Are these certifications really changing the frontline impact of patient care? And as you said, and I love that story about the initial conversation with the CEO at that point, should we be afraid of what we're going to find? The answer really is no, because either way, it's going to help us to improve. Either this is great and there's a strong correlation and it's clear to see, or maybe it's not so strong, and then the question is, what can we do to make this better?
Correct. And, it's, when I was in the military, we had a saying about being on the tip of the spear. It's not easy going first and asking the tough questions, but we decided to do it. So in the first study, we found some things. There were positive correlations between having more certified nurses and certain complications. What we found in the second study was more encouraging. And what we found out, if you did a very simple correlation and all you want to do was look at the surgical site infection rate and a percentage of nurses that are certified, it's a very simple statistical test. But in those tests, we found that there was a positive correlation, generally a positive inverse relationship. So basically, the more nurses that you have that are certified, the lower your surgical site infection rates are. And that very simple test was very encouraging. But it's simple. So that's what I reported in Boston at this conference was, if you dig into it deeper and add in all kinds of other things like the how sick the patient is, how long their surgery lasted, things like that, then what we found is the effect, even though in many cases it was positive to have more nurses that were certified, in many cases it wasn't statistically significant. So what we're finding out is there's a tremendous amount of factors that come into play if you're going to get a surgical site infection.
Right.
It's helpful, it's a positive thing to have more nurses be certified. We don't know the exact mechanism of action, but we do have rich areas that we can continue to do research, and we're encouraged by what we found. There's a thing called the Magnet program. The American Nurses Credentialing Center, ANCC, has a Magnet program. And what we found, which is very encouraging, that if a facility held ANCC Magnet status, that the correlation, you had a much lesser chance of developing an SSI if you received care at a Magnet facility. So if you put the whole picture together, a better work environment for the nurses that are providing surgical care and care after surgery equals a much lower chance of developing a surgical site infection. So we can build off that sort of thing and then do further research, and we will. We fully intend to keep looking at areas like this.
So you presented in Boston, and I know there's been a number of articles that have come out through different industry publications there. And in fact, I remember the day I saw the first headline of this study, I was driving to work, and don't do this, guys, don't look at your phone when you're driving to work, but I did. And I remember I almost had to pull over immediately and stop because this thing shocked me so much that, oh my gosh, someone has finally put these pieces together, that all the work and all the progress that we've been pushing for certification. And of course, I'm looking at this from the sterile processing industry as well, but I've been confronted time after time. Why does it matter? Does it matter for pay? Does it matter for productivity? Does it matter for safety? And I remember seeing that headline thinking, wow, the first piece of this puzzle, and as you said, it's a big puzzle and we got a lot of pieces left, but the first piece finally been put in there. What has the industry response at large? So that's mine. I almost drove my car off the highway there, but at the conference and these publications, what kind of feedback are you getting from these facilities and these nurses to the road that you're going down?
Yeah, predictably, the response has been very positive from nurses. And interestingly enough, we included other specialties because they were in this database. So we also had information about post-anesthesia care nurses, the recovery room, and the effect was actually greater. It was a very positive thing for the recovery room nurses. So they were very grateful. The other group that benefited, so I think the biggest thing is it spurred more nursing groups to get into doing research, to include the PACU nurses, recovery room nurses. They received very favorable publicity from this. And we published in the AORN Journal the results of the very first study. The second study that we focused on SSIs, we have manuscripts in process right now under review. In other publications, we've gone to others besides the AORN Journal, and we've gone to them, but we've also spurred other research. The wound and ostomy nurses, another big group, they have a big interest in surgical site infections, pressure ulcers after surgery. They did a study, and they found that a larger number of certified wound and ostomy nurses had a statistically significant effect to lower complication rates for things like pressure ulcers. And so they collaborated with us. We shared data, spoke to them about the research, and connected them to the researchers at NDNQI. And their study, they're ecstatic with their results, and they published their results. So we've spurred on more research, and people brought up great questions. Have you ever considered looking at this? What about these factors? So more research is happening, and for the operating room, we aren't rich and deep in nursing research, but we're opening up new avenues for people that want to do nursing research and further their education. We're opening up the possibilities and showing people just what could happen, or areas that you could look at.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Jim. I mean, I think the more you answer questions that are being asked, the more momentum you get for being able to get funding and some of those other challenges where you can just but continue to mine that data and expand everybody's insights into the application of, clinical nursing or any clinical, practice that's happening in the hospital. Even the wound care nurses, what a great opportunity to align with them, especially relative to infection and SSIs. And, I guess one final question before we wrap up too, but how are you finding engagement from infection control nurses that may be operating in the hospitals? And, I'm sure that they get involved with sort of the wound care area, but sometimes the OR can be pretty intimidating. We talked about that on a prior show as well. Do you see engagement from infection control?
We are, and we get a chance to interact when at various professional meetings, etc. And we're finding more engagement. Part of the difficulty with the OR though is I think people have the misconception that all operating room nurses have some sort of infection control training just because they do a lot of sterile technique. That's not the case. I think we have an opportunity to work with infection control nurses and really be more inviting and bring them into the OR. But we are getting some engagement, and some of the journals that specialize in infection control have picked up on the study and mentioned it or referenced our work. So we're making inroads. We have a long way to go, and I think that's another potential partnership. Is the people that's their main work is infection control. I think it's another opportunity.
All right, we'll be right back after a short break. Jim, we ended the last segment talking a little bit about collaboration with infection control, and I want to shift gears and focus on collaboration, interdisciplinary really, but obviously focusing a lot on sterile processing, certified technicians, etc. And I know Hank wants to talk about the power of data regarding certification and some other things. But maybe start there. I know nursing can be somewhat of a closed culture, and I know that sometimes maybe can be seen as an obstacle for other professions or other professionals to collaborate with nursing. I don't know if you have any thoughts in that regard.
I would agree with your statement. I've been a nurse for a long time. I've really not, the other professions who work in the operating room, worked with them, but, being an orderly is not a profession. So I think there's an opportunity there for nursing to collaborate. And, we have authoritative documents that encourage nurses to increase their interprofessional collaboration. And it's a challenge for us. And I agree. I think we tend to look at, what resources does nursing have versus we could say, what other professions could we collaborate with that could help us here, that have the expertise, that maybe we could learn from their expertise. And I think there's opportunities there. One of the biggest ones, and obviously I have an OR slant to this, acknowledging the expertise of central processing and then figure out how we can work together better. I think there's opportunities there. OR nurses, I think one thing that we really have to acknowledge is we don't have all the answers. And there may be others that have more expertise in a very specialized area like decon. We don't do it, but it's essential to sterilization, and ultimately we depend on the results of that work if we want good patient outcomes from surgery.
Yeah, Jim, that's so true. And I know Justin mentioned, I think it was in the first segment, about the importance on that decontamination portion, even at the point of use cleaning. And I've become kind of a nerd in studying the CMS results that are published at these facilities that have had major quality breakdowns. And almost to a facility, when you read through there, you see findings there and sites that talk about the challenges at that point of use cleaning step. And there, if it fails there, no matter how diligent sometimes the technicians or the equipment are downstairs in the sterile processing department, it becomes an insurmountable challenge to get through the biofilm even, or to do so efficiently enough to safely get those items turned around again, maybe for a case in the afternoon. And so that connection to the importance of sharing that understanding, but then also having the open culture of we can learn from each other and respect each other and then grow together as industries. So I wanted to delve into this a little bit deeper, talking about the power of these data points that you've been connecting through CCI with the different databases. On the sterile processing perspective, we've got a handful of states now across the country that require sterile processing certification, but the vast majority still there's no requirement whatsoever. And even in the state of Texas where I live, there are many facility leaders out there who are trying to make the argument, trying to prove the point that there's got to be some standardization, there's got to be some continuing education requirements in this industry for us to get over these quality challenges. How do you see this data that you're just now beginning to mine in the perioperative side? How do you see that impacting that challenge?
So I think we have only just begun to scratch the surface on what's possible with this data. So there are other databases out there that we haven't touched. We've only done one study, and truly we only looked at 2 surgical procedures, colon cases and hysterectomies. One of the most commonly performed procedures in the United States, and the number is going to keep increasing with baby boomers, etc., total joint replacements. Those, if you get a surgical site infection there, a deep infection, that's catastrophic and horrendously expensive. So room for other studies, but combining other data. So we only have information about nurses. What if we looked at the hospital and considered not only the nature of the nursing workforce, but what about the nature of the workforce for central processing? Are the results better for the states where it's mandatory that you be certified to practice? Because I can tell you for nursing, no state in the union is it mandatory that you be certified in nursing to practice. None. So your profession is actually ahead of nursing. But, could we look at not only the nursing workforce and what we know about the infection rates and the nature of surgery done in a facility, but what if we combine that with the information we had about central processing or the environmental services team that cleans the OR? Because they're just beginning to up the education levels there and do certifications. And could we look at things too, like what type of education did they have? Orientation, was it standardized? For central processing, at one time, there was very good training that was done by the Purdue Extension University. They had a very nice curriculum for central processing. There's a variety of courses that perioperative nurses take. If we could put together more data, what type of training did they have? What was the nature, the length of their orientation? How long have they been certified? By whom? And what do they have to do to keep their certification? What's more effective? Because I have a feeling that there are other educational experiences, other professional development experiences that may be every bit as effective or more effective than continuing education credits.
Yeah, so that's a fantastic point and a challenge that I have been confronting even in our own corner of the healthcare universe and sterile processing is there is, because we have two certification bodies primarily for our industry, and they each have different requirements for continuing education units. There's a huge and understandable focus on the importance of those credits, but oftentimes, and this is a challenge that I was speaking with Justin about today, is there's more information and there's more education to be had than only what can be found under the label of one CEU credit. And oftentimes, and this goes back to what you were talking about at the beginning, that interdisciplinary knowledge is one of those things. So there could be great sterile processing programs out there that don't come with nursing CEUs, for instance, but they are still very beneficial for perioperative folks to sit through or to watch on a webinar to listen to, and vice versa. So, coming to that context of I need that continuing education to keep my certification current and compliant, yes, but the reason that, and I'll let you speak to this, what is the fundamental behind-the-scenes reason that you require CEUs for the folks who hold your credentials?
Well, so I will tell you, we have begun to question the value of continuing education. We've made the assumption forever that if you increase your knowledge level, that'll result in better patient outcomes. And, it seems logical enough. Increase your knowledge level, that'll translate into better patient care. The research-based evidence of a passive continuing education experience, you sit in the class, people talk, you fill out an eval, the science behind the effectiveness of that is not very good. There are groups that have studied this. The Citizens Advisory Council has put out white papers on this, and they suggest that there's other methods that are more effective than CE. As an organization, the Competency and Credentialing Institute is shifting away from allowing people to recertify solely by CE. For the CSSM credential and the CNSCP credential, no one can recertify by only doing continuing education. It's not allowed. They have to do other learning activities like academic credit, presenting, doing professional presentations. It's other learning experiences which have a better research-based rationale behind them. We're shifting that way, and there's a group that accredits. It's an umbrella organization that does accreditation for certification groups. The Institute for Credentialing Excellence, ICE, and their accreditation arm is NCCA. Don't ask me what that acronym stands for. It's NCCA. And they are they're sponsoring research about the effectiveness of other methods, and they're pushing on the accreditation process. They're asking a lot of questions. That very question, we found that at CCI when somebody said, so why do you say that CE is an effective recertification mechanism? And truthfully, the answer, we didn't have a good answer. And we're changing. That's the very question that groups like NCCA ask in your accreditation process. What's the rationale for that mechanism? And what we're finding is the research isn't that strong. And so in line with the direction from the NCCA, we're beginning to change our methods. I think the future, The methods we've been using forever are going to be increasingly challenged, and we're going to have to come up with better answers. I think research is part of that to get us to the better answer. But again, if you're finding that the nature of your certification and your continuing education processes, if research shows us that it does make a statistically significant difference, then I think it's up to the leadership of the certification groups to start changing and coming up with more effective methods for the good of their certificates, but ultimately to yield better patient outcomes. And we have to ask the hard questions.
So, Jim, we have some of the best listeners in all of podcasting, and I know they're sitting out here listening to this, and if they're anything like me, they're being moved to action. So there's challenges out here for CEUs. There's data out here to be had and connected. If somebody's maybe sitting there, certified surgical tech, certified sterile processing tech, certified operating room nurse, and they're hearing our discussion today, and they want to get involved, they want to help, they want to be a part of the solution, how would you recommend they get started? Who do they need to connect to? What do they need to be reading? Who do they need to be following to stay on the front of this battle for change?
There is excellent information that's put out by the Institute for Credentialing Excellence. They have a very active research agenda. They have white papers. There's excellent information there. I'll just say it. CCI is active in research. We would welcome partnerships with other groups that have similar goals. Obviously, central processing is a lot of people that are credentialed. We would welcome the opportunity to work there with other groups and collaborate. The other thing I will say, if you're a nurse, and I realize not everyone that works in central processing is a nurse, there are actually funding opportunities out there. CCI gives scholarships for people that do nursing research. It's done through the AORN Foundation. So there's money out there. There is good information on our website at the Competency and Credentialing Institute. There's very good information about research in this area. There's also information, if you want to get involved, say at the level of your hospital, we have an instrument that we let people use. There's no charge. It's called the Perceived Value of Certification Tool. Very simple. We actually support people that want to use the tool, and you can use it for free and do some very basic survey research to establish, what's the baseline? What are the people that are certified, what do they feel about the value of certification? And we help you with that instrument. Beyond that, I think research is stronger when you have more of the stakeholders involved, and CCI in particular would welcome the opportunity for people that want to do research in this area. We'd welcome the opportunity for partnership. Doing research like this, and say you involve the leadership staff of central processing with the operating room nurses, there are some rich opportunities, and you do not need doctoral level preparation to participate in research. There's great opportunities out there.
We have been speaking with Jim Stobinski, CEO at the Competency and Credentialing Institute. Jim, I want to thank you again for coming on the show. This has been really enlightening. You're talking to two data nerds here, but I think the biggest takeaway from everything that you've said is really focusing on collaboration. So thank you for collaborating with us and our podcasting efforts, and hopefully we can help get the message out.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and it is a pleasure.
That was Jim Stobinski, CEO at the Competency and Credentialing Institute. Jim was a fantastic guest yet again, Hank, and I think the collaboration focus, especially coming from a nurse, is a great message.
That's right, and we didn't get into it as much as we could have, but the mission statement for CCI is to lead competency credentialing to promote safe, quality patient care and professional development through lifelong learning. And that whole conversation was tying in what that means in terms of data, what it means in terms of frontline patient care that's provided, and then ultimately what that means for other departments out there across surgical services. So fantastic time with Jim today.
He made a great point too, which is an interesting perspective, that sterile processing is ahead of nursing because there are actually states in the union that require certification, and there's none in the union that requires nursing certifications. I thought that was a great point.
That's right. I think from the perspective of sterile processing, we view these nurses as already degreed, if you will. They went through a nursing program through a local college, and then that certification is an extra step. On our side of the equation, you can walk into a sterile processing department and get a job off the street. So certification really separates us in terms of knowledge and even exposure maybe to the broader industry challenges out there. So it was interesting to compare those two and then also look at it from the data standpoint as well.
And yet another guest emphasizing the underutilization of partnering with infection control. It really is starting to become clear to me in our discussions that that infection control could be a very central figure in what he described as a need for interdisciplinary sort of collaboration and convergence for great patient care, and especially with the change in CMS and value-based purchasing, as he duly noted.
Exactly. So he brought up 2 to 5% of all surgeries are ending now in surgical site infections. That's a job that's going to keep any infection control preventionist busy and awake at night. But you're right, that teamwork across surgical services through the sterile processing into infection control, such a critical aspect of how we're going to push this industry forward. And it's a theme that I don't think we have heard the last of either.
And it's important to note, I think, how brave it was for CCI to say, let's do a study and find out if our purpose is even relevant, statistically speaking. That's a pretty bold move, and one that I think has a very big picture in mind. It's not necessarily going to undermine the Institute, but yet help the Institute be more effective in its main goal. And I just think sometimes you can get short-sighted with that big picture and think this threatens our very existence, and instead the organization went a completely different direction and said, no, let's find out, and then let's make the necessary changes to make it statistically valid and have an impact moving forward in the industry. A very brave move on their part.
That's right. A lot of respect for what they did. And obviously there's a lot of industry response standing up and taking note and saying, you know what? Now that they have paved the way, they took the bold step. Now let's also, join behind them. And as Jim said, there's a lot of data out there still untapped that still needs folks to make that decision, even in their own slice of the healthcare universe, to say, dive into this data, show what's really going on with this education and certification, and then make smart, informed decisions to make our credentials better and our patients safer.
So as we close, I will say that another value added is their perceived value of certification tool. We'll provide that link in the write-up to this podcast. So if you have interest in that, make sure you go back and check that out. I also want to remind our listeners that as we prepare for CS week, the second full week in October, that we do want your submissions for some success stories that we will be highlighting in a bonus edition podcast on CS Week, just really to tout all the good work that everybody is doing every day in departments, sterile processing departments across the country. So if you have a submission for us, again, 1 to 2 paragraphs, just something that we can highlight on the show and commend you for the good work that you're doing in improving patient safety. To do that, just send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. That's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on iTunes and Stitcher. We'd appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to us. And on behalf of Hank and myself, thank you for listening to another edition of Beyond Clean.